Welcome everyone to a virtual presentation by Dr. Jessica Heier Stamm. It'll be over industrial engineering applications in pandemic preparedness and response. Amy, would you like to give an introduction?
Yes. I have the pleasure of knowing Dr. Jessica Heier Stamm for some time, and I am pleased that she was able to join us and provide a presentation today, and I will give a brief overview of her bio. Dr. Jessica Heier Stamm is an associate professor, and I'm going to probably pronounce this wrong, Gisela and Warren Kennedy Cornerstone Teaching Scholar in the Industrial and Manufacturing Systems Engineering Department at Kansas State University. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Industrial Engineering from Kansas State University and a PhD in Industrial and Systems Engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology. Her research focuses on designing and improving humanitarian relief and public health logistics systems. She teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in operations research and supply chain logistics. She received a National Science Foundation Career Award in 2017 and the Kansas State University Commerce Bank and W.T. Kemper Foundation Outstanding Teacher Award in 2020. So we're really excited to have her here to present to us today, and I will turn it over to Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy and Emmett, for the invitation, and thank you all for being here to join us today. I'm looking forward to our time together. I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation screen here. All right. Is that good? Confirmation there?
Yes.
Okay. If there are questions as we go along, please feel free to add those to the chat. And I know that Amy and Emmett are going to be monitoring that. I'm happy to make this a dialogue. But Amy asked that I share a little bit about industrial engineering applications in pandemic preparedness and response. And this really grew out of a similar event that the Industrial Engineering Department hosted virtually in the fall with several of our alums in a variety of industry sectors, just describing impacts of the pandemic, how their industrial engineering skills have played a role in the way that they and their organizations have responded. And so I'll focus primarily today on public health applications and some of the work that I and others at K-State have been doing on the education and research side. But I'm going to start just by touching on a variety of ways that the tools in our industrial and systems engineering toolbox really can contribute in this sphere. So starting there with the toolbox, I want to acknowledge, and I do this with all of my classes as well, that the experience and expertise in the room is not limited to what I can bring to the table here. So I imagine that all of you have been using the tools that you learned and have developed over your career in industrial and systems engineering in your own workplace to think about whether that's work design, safety, redesigning processes, thinking about the changes that have to happen in forecasting for supply and demand, thinking about managing the inventory processes, all the logistics, because all of these tools are relevant in every business environment, whether that's public health or all of the other sectors. As we've seen, the pandemic has absolutely touched every aspect of how we work and live. Certainly all of the tools that we have in our toolbox are relevant and are critical. And as we go forward in this evening's presentation, I'd be happy to hear how you and your organization have employed those tools, because that allows me to go back and share with our students and motivate them and say, hey, these are things that your employers are going to want you to be able to do. What you're learning is absolutely relevant. But I do want to focus, I'm actually going to flip it. Usually we think about preparedness and response in a crisis setting, but because all of us are right in the middle of living through this historic event, we're really more focused on what is the response right now. So I'm going to give some examples from research and education that are happening at K-State, centered around ways that we are responding as industrial engineers, or can be responding as industrial engineers, to the needs generated by the pandemic. First, I want to highlight one way that folks on campus have been leveraging their capabilities in manufacturing research to contribute directly to the response in our healthcare community. So early on, clear back in April, May, there was a real shortage. You probably heard about it, for the swabs that were necessary to conduct the PCR, the gold standard test for identifying active coronavirus infection. And supply chain challenges associated with manufacturing those swabs. And we saw, not just in our community, but across the country, a lot of places that had 3D printing capability leverage that capability to produce these swabs. And at K-State, in our own IISE department, that involved Dr. Dong Lin, one of our manufacturing faculty, in partnership with the Northeast Kansas Healthcare Coalition and the Community Healthcare System of Northeast Kansas, which is based out of Onega and other small communities in that region. So basically provided a local source for these swabs to be able to stay ahead of the disease. I've really focused in the classroom on helping students understand the ways that the skills that we're learning are applicable to what they're seeing in the pandemic response as well. So I had the great fortune to teach the supply chain logistics engineering class in the fall, and I started the semester by saying it's absolutely a wonderful time to be studying supply chain logistics, because now everybody knows what a supply chain is. Even if you'd never thought about supply chain before in your life, every supply chain that we interact with broke. And so now everybody's interested in how we're going to fix it, and you are learning the tools, the skill set that's necessary for that, and those skills are in high demand. And so I modified my usual course project for the semester to allow the students to focus specifically on supply chain impacts of the pandemic and opportunities for the fundamental logistics engineering models and skills that we were learning in the class to be applied across multiple sectors. So they could choose an industry sector or a specific company or a specific product type that they wanted to investigate, basically understand what were the supply chain impacts and opportunities. And across a variety of sectors, industries, companies, product types, there were a lot of common themes that the students brought up and that we all have experienced. On the supply side, we really experienced a lot of supply side disruption, stemming originally from production shutdowns when countries around the world went into lockdown. And then as capacity came back, it was at a reduced level compared to normal. There were transportation limits. And so when passenger flights, international passenger flights decreased significantly, a fair bit of our air cargo transport actually happens in the bellies of passenger airplanes. And so that impacted the way that air cargo was moved and slowed down a lot of transportation. There were, of course, limitations on drivers, mitigated to some extent by changes in policy that a lot of governors enacted as part of their emergency response. But thinking about quarantine requirements for drivers who are crossing state borders and navigating all of those challenges. And then we saw a lot of export restrictions, especially on products that were directly implicated in the pandemic response, like personal protective equipment. So we were unable to import those because the countries of origin had limited the number of exports that they would allow. Of course, we all experience the demand side disruption. So the changes in consumption that the pandemic brought on, more people at home. And so instead of eating at schools or at restaurants, now we're buying more from the grocery store. I know I was astonished when I first started buying groceries for my family and we were home, all of us, all day, every day, how much food my kids actually eat. And so that change in channel, the retail channel, and the change in the kinds of products that people were buying, coupled with the reduction in production capacity for certain kinds of products like meat, definitely led to additional disruptions. There was panic buying, of course, we're all familiar with that, and the demand side disruption that simply occurred because of the sudden surge in demand for products like masks. And this was across all sectors, so I was really excited to see the variety of companies and sectors and products that the students picked. Everything from a company like Gojo that produces hand sanitizer. Of course, we all know 3M, the maker of the most common N95 respirator. But we learned in class from one of the students about the impact on the pet food supply chain and on the food and beverage supply chain, even on the PlayStation 5 supply chain because of the surge in demand and the rollout of gaming systems during the pandemic. So every sector was impacted in a variety of ways. And the students really articulated that it was very meaningful to them to be able to think about the concepts from the supply chain course and tie them directly to what they were seeing in the news and experiencing at the grocery store, and understand how they could play a role in improving those systems going forward. Now we're thinking about specifically in the public health sector, and this is where I spend a majority of my research time thinking about how we can use those tools from our industrial engineering toolbox to improve public health logistics systems. So a major system that that we're hearing about in the news every day right now is the vaccination system. So there's the whole process of distribution that I'll touch on in a minute, but the piece that we will all have the opportunity to interact with is the actual system of driving through or walking into a clinic to receive that vaccine. And so as industrial engineers, if we look at this photo of a mock mass vaccination clinic for influenza, it immediately brings back those memories from simulation class or from queuing theory. This is a classical process design task where many of the same standard measures that we're accustomed to employing in any process design, like throughput, understanding the length of the queue, understanding the average waiting time that that's going to happen with the processes, all those things are absolutely relevant here. But there are some important distinctions that are not unique to public health, but certainly a hallmark of public health applications. And those are issues around accessibility. So by our design choices, who are we including or excluding from the benefit of vaccination in this system? And can we make choices to intentionally accommodate those that might have accessibility differences, whether that's somebody that doesn't have a car, somebody who doesn't have English as a first language, variety of implications there for design. And also equity. So anytime we choose a location or a system design for vaccination, We've got to think about who's driving the farthest, who's waiting the longest. Are we further disadvantaging those who already have poorer access to healthcare systems in the first place? And I'm happy to have the opportunity this semester to advise one of our senior design teams who's working on some of these challenges for Riley County. That's the county in Kansas where Kansas State University is located. So we are working with the Riley County Health Department to think about many of these design questions to try to help them as they think about scaling up vaccination to the broader public. And these are questions that actually started my career thinking about. When I was a graduate student, that was during the H1N1 pandemic. And so the vaccine distribution system that's being used for the COVID-19 vaccines now in many ways resembles the one that was used for the H1N1 vaccine in 2009, 2010. In particular, there are some key decisions that are being made and some key challenges that the system faces. So right now, as was also the case at the beginning of the vaccination campaign for H1N1, the demand for vaccine greatly exceeds the supply of that vaccine. So anytime we're dealing with a shortage situation, and this is true across multiple sectors, but anytime we're dealing with a shortage situation, we have this tension between efficiency or effectiveness, right? So how many people can I vaccinate, how quickly, and equity. Okay, so I can send all the vaccines that I have to New York and get a lot of people vaccinated really quickly, but that doesn't end the pandemic in Kansas. Or even more locally, I can send a lot of vaccine and work through a lot of people if I focus on the metro areas. But that in the public health context has that tension with the equity that we expect because of the impacts of the pandemic being felt across the entire state. So we are in this shortage situation where demand greatly exceeds supply, and that means that we've got to allocate our scarce resources. If we think about this from an industrial and systems engineering perspective, all comes down to our choice of objective function and metrics. And so the key decisions here that are driven by those metrics are the allocation decisions. The way that the system is designed is that the federal government allocates vaccine to the states, and then each individual state has their own plan about how they will allocate the number of doses that they've received to service providers. These are county public health departments, hospitals, and so forth. And then that last mile is when individuals have access to the vaccine at the variety of service locations. And any of us that work on logistics know that the last mile is the most challenging. So some specific challenges besides the shortage issue that this system is facing. There's a severe lack of information about future quantities. So this increases the planning burden, right? We've all become more accustomed in the past 10 months than we were before to making decisions under great uncertainty. But we know that it increases our cognitive burden, it increases our planning burden because we have to think about contingencies and possible scenarios. And so that places a great stress on the people who are trying to roll out these systems. There are some unique characteristics of the vaccine in terms of its storage requirements that create challenges, especially for low resource settings. So speaking specifically about the vaccine, the first vaccine that was approved, that received emergency use authorization from the government, the Pfizer vaccine requires ultra cold storage temperatures. There's also the issue of the minimum quantities of a given vaccine that can be shipped to any location at any time. We saw this also with the H1N1 vaccine, which didn't have the cold storage requirements, but certain communities will not meet the minimum quantity requirement. And so this is a challenge for small communities to be able to receive vaccine and roll it out efficiently when those minimum quantities are larger than what they can process in a reasonable amount of time. Another important challenge is the staffing, right? So thinking about the fact that right now in the response, the public health and hospital workers who are already overwhelmed by the pandemic response are now at the front line also of the vaccination system. So this is a challenge. And then that last mile piece, right? So individuals have access to vaccine at service locations. So anytime we're making location decisions, thinking about how far do people need to travel, is the service location accessible for people without a car? Are the decisions that we're making about this vaccine distribution system exacerbating already existing disparities based on location, based on resource level in healthcare access? And so this all really comes down to many trade-offs between a centralized approach, right? We as industrial and systems engineers like to look at the whole system and understand how to optimize all of its pieces working together, and a decentralized approach where the local entities understand best about how to reach those communities, how to mitigate those disparities in access, and to get the vaccine out. So there are some promising signs as I think about the vaccine distribution system. There is, I think, earlier than what we saw in the H1N1 process, a greater effort to leverage existing private sector capabilities. So we see that in the partnership with Walgreens and CVS to go into nursing homes to vaccinate residents and staff. So that's coming sooner in the process than it did with the H1N1 campaign. But again, thinking about which communities cannot be served by Walgreens and CVS, and then how do we to mitigate that potential disparity. And I do see a greater attention on the part of planners to mitigating disparities between communities than at least was evident to me at the time of the beginning parts of the H1N1 distribution process. So all of those things are encouraging. There are just lots of opportunities for our skill set to be applied to this system. I'm going to shift gears for a bit and think about preparedness, right? So someday, the acute crisis that is the COVID-19 pandemic will be behind us, and we'll have more space to think about preparing for and mitigating the risk of future similar events. And this is an ongoing process, right? It's cyclical, just like any kind of business planning process. And preparedness had been happening for major pandemics well before this one began. But we now have experienced something that none of us have experienced in our lifetime before in terms of the scale and magnitude. And so we have this opportunity to really use that as we go forward. So I'm going to highlight in my last few prepared remarks some ongoing work that I and students that I advise have been doing with the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. And this project actually began in 2018 in response to a requirement from the Health and Human Services Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. So this is a federal government entity that outlines key preparedness and response capabilities that every jurisdiction needs to demonstrate. And this is part of ongoing funding for preparedness and response that comes to each state and jurisdiction from the federal government. The state needs to demonstrate the capability to be able to provide continuity of care delivery. And under that, a key component is, of course, maintaining access to the essential resources, supplies, and equipment. And so the Kansas Department of Health and Environment Preparedness Program reached out to me to see if we at K-State could help them along this activity of assessing supply chain integrity. Basically, where are the vulnerabilities in the supply chains that support health care and public health services in the state? And so a bit of background about how this process with the federal funds for preparedness work. Every state was required as a condition of receiving preparedness cooperative agreement funds to establish what are called healthcare coalitions, or I'll call them HCCs. Healthcare coalitions include representatives from public and private health organizations, from emergency management, emergency medical services, and related organizations, and they are regional. In Kansas, there are 7 regional healthcare coalitions, and their borders are indicated here by the different colors of counties. And within that HCC, you've got representatives from each of the county public health departments, all of the hospitals, the emergency medical services, and so forth. And the role of the coalitions is basically to help their communities prepare for, respond to, and recover from all hazards. So this includes pandemic, but also tornado, wildfire, mass casualty event, anything that impacts the ability of the healthcare system to meet the community's needs. And so they work together on planning and organizing and other activities, basically as an information and resource sharing network. And so if we think about the supply chains that support their daily operations, they really wanted to better understand what these supply chains look like. And so, for a bunch of industrial and systems engineers, I don't have to spend a lot of time on a supply chain diagram, but each coalition consists of each of these individual members. You've got the various hospitals and health departments in the community and so forth. Each one of them has their own supply chain network for all of the stuff that they need to meet their patients' needs. And so that stuff moves through distributors from manufacturers in response to information that flows from the coalition members about their demands. This is all basically private sector operation, but there is also a public sector component as well. So this comes in the form of the Strategic National Stockpile, which is a federal stockpile of health equipment and supplies. And then the state of Kansas also maintains a cache of certain kind of supplies and equipment as well. And so like any supply chain network, including all the ones that we just talked about, my students describing this semester, there are vulnerabilities, and so we wanted to understand what are the vulnerabilities, how could the supply chain integrity be compromised in these systems? Well, there are manufacturing disruptions because of faulty raw materials or worker strikes. There are distribution interruptions because of labor strikes or transportation issues because of storms, any of those potential components. And there are also demand side disruptions in terms of the actual events that might create a surge in demand. So understanding how these pieces fit together is not necessarily something that health departments are thinking about on a daily basis, but it could potentially directly impact their operations. So the scope of our project was really to think about on the private sector side, who are the main distributors for the key supplies and equipment that these coalition members rely on for meeting their community's needs? And so in our initial investigation, we focused on all hazards, but we initially prioritized sort of 2 very different kinds of hazards that communities might face: a high consequence infectious disease outbreak or a mass casualty event. And we asked coalition members to identify their distributors or suppliers for all of the equipment and supply categories that you see here. And these were defined by ASPR, that's the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. And so if you look across this list, it's basically anything that the the health department or the hospital may need to provide care, provide the services that their community needs. And what we were able to help elucidate for the healthcare coalitions and for KDHE were some really important opportunities for continuing to strengthen supply chain integrity in Kansas. First, it became clear that supply chain capabilities need to be exercised along with all of the other key capabilities that they were routinely exercising. Certainly, the live action drill that they've been running for the past 10 months has been an exercise like nobody could have ever planned. And there will be many lessons that continue to be gleaned from that in the coming months and years. We also were able to describe for KDHE and the coalitions the diversity of strategies that they are using to ensure adequate supply. So some of the larger entities are using distributor managed inventory to manage their rotation and their stock. Some hospitals, health departments, and coalitions have their own caches. And they also rely a lot on mutual aid, so coordination within and between organizations. But we heard repeatedly that this task of cash management really poses a lot of challenges, especially for the smaller regions and communities in terms of keeping their data current, maintaining the visibility of what's in stock, rotating that stock as it expires. So these are classic industrial engineering inventory management problems where we can come in and help to develop some tools for them to work on that. And they have a data sharing system that's meant to make visible across the state the resources that are available for deployment, but there are some opportunities that they have begun to address to make that system better meet its potential. And this last piece, the trade-offs that exist, I think that every supply chain is grappling with these trade-offs right now. So especially in health, there has been a growing consolidation among key distributors and suppliers to where a handful of distributors basically are responsible for the majority of the market. That brings with it great economies of scale and scope, the ability to move product around to where the demand is and leverage that scale and scope. But it also leads to this all eggs in one basket risk, where supplier diversification maybe is more costly. It's more costly to maintain greater number of relationships with vendors, vet all of them, make sure that they are producing product up to spec. But it certainly diversifies that risk portfolio if one distributor or vendor is unable to meet demand. So these are things that the state health department was working on prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, and I know that they will continue to be working on these things and many of the supply chain lessons that will come as a result of the pandemic. And so that really brings me to my closing thought, which is what happens next. And this is not just for public health and healthcare specifically, but I think more broadly for all of us, no matter which industry or sector we are in. And so as I tried to think about what that might look like for us as industrial and systems engineers, three thoughts came to mind. And I had to go and search for the origins of these quotes, but thoughts that I think kind of coalesce into the idea that there are lots of important opportunities for us as industrial and systems engineers. So first, never let a good crisis go to waste, right? So we have the opportunity to learn and to change our systems for the better as a result of what we have learned. And there's research in human behavior and so forth that says you've got a small window after a crisis by which you can leverage that crisis to actually make a change, and that window closes fast. So never let a good crisis go to waste. every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. So this is coming from names that we would recognize as management, students of management, right? So Deming and colleagues. So we have to think about how we're designing our systems. Are we designing them to be very, very efficient, but brittle? How can we balance efficiency with resilience? And this is really salient when it comes to supply chain, but I think it's applicable across the board. And I've heard several of our partners in the public health sector encourage us to think not just about preparedness, right? Because if I say that this is a preparedness activity, that's one task for one person off in a corner to check a box. But if I embed this idea of preparedness and resilience across my day-to-day operations, are there changes that I can make in routine operations that we're going to be doing every single day that will make us more resilient and more prepared? Then that's going to have greater sticking power than if I think of this just as preparedness in its own little box as a task for somebody to complete. And I think as industrial and systems engineers, we're uniquely positioned to bring our tools to these kinds of challenges and have an impact going forward. And so with that, I definitely want to acknowledge the members of my team. So you see here Katie and Cami, who recently finished their bachelor's and master's degrees in IE and worked a lot on the project with the KDHE, and then our partners at KDHE and the Healthcare Coalitions for their involvement. You've got my email address there, and I know that Emmett and Amy can share it if you've got follow-up questions afterward, but I'm going to see if I can stop sharing and take some questions.
And there is a question in the chat that
Okay.
Anita posed. So.
So can you speak to additional factors of considerations between government distribution versus retail distribution, CVS and Walgreens? Yeah, so there are a number of factors, and I'd be interested to hear others' perspectives as well, right? So CVS and Walgreens and others, right? Other pharmacy chains, independent local pharmacists, they've got that presence in the community already, which implies a number of things. On the system side, it implies a supply chain process and staffing, people that are already trained or can readily be trained to give vaccinations. Whereas, you know, in the public health departments and in the hospitals, the folks that are tasked with doing that are then taken away from other tasks that are central to the response as well. So there's that piece. There's also the trust piece, right? So those pharmacies, people are likely to already have a relationship with a pharmacy or a pharmacist. And so that makes a difference in education about the vaccine and trust about receiving the vaccine as well. Now, not every community has a CVS or a Walgreens, and so it's not the only channel. I think to effectively reach all of the communities that we need to reach with the vaccine, it's got to be a both and strategy and not an either or.
Yeah, and some of that, I know that they've shared, you know, at some meetings we've had at Blue Cross with the plan to get the distribution out and increasing those channels. So I know that we are working with Shawnee County Department and trying to, the health department, and trying to make sure that we can expand those. So for example, Blue Cross with 1,600 employees may end up being a hub of distribution, which we do for the flu shot anyway. Those kinds of things, thinking of new channels so that, you know.
And I think those new channels will become even more feasible as we start to perhaps get other vaccines with emergency use authorization that do not require some of the cold storage that the Pfizer vaccine requires.
Definitely.
Hello, this is John Huffman from Wichita, and I've got a question. Is this kind of directed to Amy? This is to you too, okay? Being at Blue Cross, okay? You're talking about channels for the distribution of the vaccine. One of the things that it kind of hit me when the map of Kansas was shown in the different coalition areas. Looks very similar to the map that we see. We've been doing a lot of work lately with the Kansas Food Bank here in Wichita, and they have a similar coalition type thing by the counties. And obviously, one of the efforts that they have to do is distribute food to elementary schools, nursing centers, daycare centers, things like that. You know, have you considered maybe teaming with them? And another thing along those lines is they also have cold storage facilities. They might be able to actually hold some of the vaccines.
I do know that one of our school districts that my husband works at, the Siemens School District here in Topeka, they are hosting a vaccine site. The teachers are in that first group, or I guess the second group, to get the vaccine. And so they are, those types of things are already being, I guess, are starting because they do have, you know, greater opportunities. So I don't know, Jessica, if you've got some other examples, but I do know they are getting into the school districts and thinking of other ways to distribute the vaccine in ways that we hadn't thought about. But yes, the cold storage is an issue, but they do have that at this school. So.
Well, I know a lot of their food trucks have cold storage in it too, so they could actually transport it. You know, I'm just throwing it out there as an idea. That maybe you need to get with them and see if you could work together on this.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that brings a couple things to mind, right? So I know that the state is, if funding and other resources permit, eventually looking at mobile vaccination. So taking the vaccine to where the people are instead of expecting people to come to the vaccine.
Right.
And also, so you mentioned the food banks and so forth. This is a way to make the vaccine very convenient for a family that may need to go to get food on a particular day. You know, the vaccine is right there. It's like your flu shot, right? You go to the grocery store to get your groceries and you stop by the pharmacy in the grocery store to get your flu shot. So whatever that can be done to minimize the barriers to people accessing the vaccine as we move through the phases and get into the opportunity to vaccinate the general public. Those kinds of things are very, very important.
One thing that does ease in the distribution is the fact that the government is covering the cost. That may not always be the case in future situations. So, I mean, and that would complicate the distribution a little bit more, I would say. So that is something I know that, you know, the administration of it, Blue Cross is covering, and then, you know, the government is covering the actual cost of the vaccine. So that is helping, I think, with the ease of distribution. Are there other questions that attendees have?
All right, so I'm going to play the teacher and ask the attendees what, and maybe the most efficient way to manage this is type into the chat rather than trying to bounce between who starts speaking first, or raise your hand if you've got a story to share. What's a way that you have used your industrial engineering skills in your environment during the pandemic as a result of changes that have had to happen? And so I'll watch for hands and I'll watch the chat too.
We have a lot of shy people today. Well, I'll go if nobody else wants to. Okay. Truthfully, it's one of the unusual things. I don't know about the actual application of skills, if there's any real difference. I think it has a lot to do with how well organizations were prepared for something like this. I said, Emmett and I had this conversation not long ago. I said, 10 years ago, this is an absolute catastrophe. Before we had the technology to do a lot of remote things and all that, this would have been an absolute catastrophe. Our economy would have tanked overnight. Now, we did see a setback and we had comeback and all that, but just doing things like the communications that we've had to do that are differently, being prepared for inventory that may not be available when we need it to be and all that. We've actually had at least a decade of new developments in industrial systems engineering, especially technical developments, that I think have buffered this a bit. I'm not saying it hasn't been a bad thing. It's been a terrible thing. It's terrible when people lose jobs. It's even worse when people lose their lives and livelihoods, but the truth is it could have been a lot worse than it was, and especially from a business perspective, our businesses have tended to survive mainly because of the things we have been doing for the last 10 years. If we hadn't done those things, I think we'd be a lot worse off right now. As far as any new things go, I think it is going to cause our companies to take a real look at, do we want to keep doing some of these heritage things that we've always been doing, or are we going to change for good now? I could tell you right now, I am absolutely positive that in most companies, productivity has actually been up during this time. I know it myself. I have a job where I have a lot of visibility and I'm involved with a lot of things. And yet I have only been to the office 5 times since last March. Okay. Everything has been, I could have been working in Alaska for all they knew. But it helped that I'm only 10 minutes away. If I had to go in, I could have, but I never had to. Everything, again, we leverage technology to make things happen. I've found that people have been a lot more cooperative during this than they usually are. I think that they realize that because we're doing this remotely, because people are expecting us to still keep up, that things have to get done. We don't have a meeting that leads to another meeting. The meeting actually gets something done, So, and again, I think that goes with a lot of, not necessarily the hard principles of industrial systems engineering, but some of the soft skills that we as IISEs tend to be really good at. We tend to know how to move things and move ourselves. And we tend to know how to put a plan together and stick to that plan. A lot of good plans that have just basically happened overnight, which in my experience usually take months and months to prepare, are being formalized very, very quickly. So
That's good news.
I think it's truly helped. And I've noticed that in most of the meetings I get in, the people that have been really called to be involved in a lot of the breakthrough activity has been the industrial systems engineer type people.
That's good. That's something I can pass on to my students as well. Thanks, John.
You're welcome.
I'm going to go to Anita Renhotra in just a second because I see that she's got her hand up. But as I'm doing that, Anita Noller says that there's been more of a focus on optionality versus optimization, right? So yeah. I think it's kind of that resilience versus efficiency and finding that trade-off. Anita Renhotra, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. So this really good, but I will share something that Hallmark has that I just.
We can't hear you very well, Anita. Are you on?
Might be better. Hang on a second.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, much better. All right. I plugged in my headset. We'll try it this way. No, I was just going to share something. It's not something that I was involved with, but that Hallmark has done that I just think was a really good way for us to get our facilities back up and running. But the screening process that we put in place for employees. And, it was involved as hiring a third party to go through all the questions, the temperature screening as people are coming in to work, because our production facilities, they're up and running. So while those of us at headquarters are working from home, but the folks in the facilities need to get into work. And it's been, that took a lot of industrial engineering skill sets to figure out how to make that happen, especially when you've got a lot of people coming in for the same shift at the same time. And, our largest facility, that's 1,500 people. And obviously not all of them on the same shift, but they just now are rolling out an app where we can do our screening, answer the questions via the app. And then when you come in, you have your temperature screening and then you get a wristband for the day. But so, still looking at ways to optimize it. But when you think about having to get clearance for that many people to come into a building physically, I just have been impressed with the process. It's from some folks that I've heard were working with the app today. It's not going that well, but so
I've actually had really good luck with the app.
Have you? Okay.
Yeah, and it is, and I'm one of the few that have been going into the office pretty much every day since the get-go.
Yeah, rub it in, Beth.
No, I'm not rubbing it in. It'd be nice to work from home a little bit. But I did feel bad for these people, and it was a third party, but the questions did change. At least early on, it changed a lot because they were screening different locations and everything. But, these poor people had, this 2, 3, 4 minute spiel every time the same way. And I almost felt like, can you just ask us if anything's changed from how we answered yesterday? And so now with the app, it allows them to go in and change the questions. You still have to click and say, answer them. But, they could change them overnight if something changed where you had to add a new question in. And then when you go in, there's the temperature, and I think I'm at headquarters, so I don't know exactly how they'll roll it out in the plants, but it's actually a wrist is how they take the temperature. It's you hold up your wrist to this device, and then you just show them your phone, and it basically gives the date and then a big green check mark that you've, answered the questions for that day. So it seems to be working pretty good, and it at least alleviates if there's a certain time that, the line would get backed up, or like I said, at Hallmark, they had the screening done outside, and then when it got cooler, they moved it into the parking garage. But still, people were out there all day, in cold weather. Now they don't have jobs, but so it's not great either, but they may have preferred it. But it is much, it's much more streamlined. So it's good.
Thanks for that. I'm going to take this question from Emmett in the chat, and then I see that Ian has his hand up, so we'll go there. So Emmett asks, does the two-shot requirement create its own set of accounting issues? Yes, partly for the reason that you identify there, because depending on which vaccine you get for the first dose, the second shot comes either 3 weeks or 4 weeks later. And so making sure that the person knows when to come back, and most of the systems that I've seen, they're scheduling that person to come at a specific day and time for their next shot at the time that they receive the first shot. But yeah, that's a whole other logistics issue just on the receiving end. But then on the supply end, you've probably seen in the news the strategy about holding back some doses to make sure that the second shot is still there versus counting on supply being uninterrupted to be able to take those doses off the line and still meet the demand in time. Some countries are even relaxing the manufacturer recommended dosing intervals, and there's a lot of discussion in the public health and epidemiology community about the risks and benefits of that as well. So Ian, what's your comment or question?
Yes, I was going back to the screening discussion earlier. I was put on a quarantine for a short time for my company and was asked to look into those systems for our facility of about 200 people. And it was fascinating to see how many different companies are out there selling the screening systems, whether they're for facial recognition, or I think the wrist temperature measurement was talked about, and then the options within those systems to either just use it as a go, no go, or to use it as getting the information from the questionnaire and capturing that temperature reading and the variety of temperature reading accuracies. And ultimately, it was very interesting. We, within the facility, decided on a system that we thought would be best to be able to have a little extra accountability within the facility, as opposed to just asking the questions for getting to ask a question, having that automated aspect of the survey to capture that information, but went through our logistics and corporate legal team, and they just decided that if any of that information was considered health information, we had to find ways to store it, and they highly recommended against anything other than a go, no go check. And so we made the decision that it wasn't value added for us to purchase just a fancy version of a thermometer when we needed to have somebody to ask the questions anyway. So we've ended up stuck with the very manual process within that. So it's interesting to hear that discussion earlier.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
All right, we have 2 minutes left, so maybe we could take one final question, or if we have no additional questions, we definitely want to thank Dr. Jessica Heier Stamm for coming today and attending our virtual meeting and presenting such a timely topic, and really providing the, oh, we do have one more question. Okay, hey, Beth Kelly.
Something minor, but it was the first time that I did yesterday that was kind of interesting. You know, we live in a age where you watch so many like YouTube videos explaining things, or at least I do. Anytime I need to fix something, you know, I YouTube to figure out how to do it. And so there was something I needed to explain to a couple basically VPs that there was no way I could find. Even I needed like 3 minutes on their calendar, but their calendar was completely booked. So I actually just did a short video because I had to demonstrate something, and I demonstrated it and then just emailed them the video, and then they were able to respond when they had time, and it worked really well. I mean, it was kind of other than it's embarrassing me being on video talking about something. It was kind of a neat tool that I hadn't really thought about doing before, that allows you to talk to somebody. Oh, it's, you know, almost like a video voicemail that, you know, here's what I'm trying to explain. They totally got it. And then, you know, were able to get back with me either while they were on other meetings, or, you know, between meetings or over lunch. So just wanted to throw that out there for other people. If you have a situation where that comes up, it worked surprisingly well.
That's a great tip. I will say one of the most painful things about teaching online classes, and this came even before the pandemic, is editing videos of myself.
It is tough having video calls and always having to see your face. I wish there was the turn off your face option, but keep your face on for everyone else. But yeah. Oh, Emmett, you're typing. Do you have a question?
I was just going to say really quick that I think that technology software applications, all the above, that those integrations between consumers and healthcare providers and health entities and health groups will really begin to significantly change and shape the way the consumer experience really flows, whether it be, you know, pandemic related or just regular everyday health checkup and health and well-being as far as that goes. I think telemedicine is really going to surge here in the next decade, and I think that that's very, very exciting from a process and pandemic preparedness standpoint.
Great points. Thank you all so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, it was great to hear from you today. And, you know, continue to reach out as we can partner with K-State on opportunities to work with the students. So
Absolutely.
thank you. All right, thank you all for your time today. And Emmett he recorded this event, so if you know of others who were not able to attend, he will be posting the link, I believe. So, great.
I will. This will be sent out via the IISE Connection Network, and it will also be posted on YouTube and on our IISE Kansas City Facebook page.
Perfect.
So thank you all for attending.
Thank
and
you.
thank you very much, Dr. Heier Stamm, for presenting to us. It's always great to hear from you, and I hope that you do very well here in the coming year.
Thank you. Best wishes to you all. Thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you.
Bye.